Anyway, this is just one schema to sort of remind us about this notion of listening in the moment when we are part of a social system and what channel we are tuned into. So, for example, and you probably can't read in detail, but typically the norm is that people are listening on what I call here channel 2, the norm, and that's affirming what we already know. It's reconfirming ourselves. And I actually, when I sit down to listen or watch a new video or read something, have to go back and check to see if I'm ready to be disconfirmed in what I already know. Am I ready to learn new things? And so then I go to the channel of the critical channel, the open channel. So anyway, this is, you can look at this later, but this is just a sort of schema of these different channels. And we all are in some form or another on different channels when we're listening to other people, when we're reading an article, when we're watching a video. We're filtering, or we're using a certain lens that allows certain kinds of information in. And that's true for, I would say, every situation. I always find that people, when they sort of become introspective and they think about how they're listening, they understand, or this schema makes sense to them. And it's good. I mean, we all need that ability. It's just to know what channel we're on, to know which one we want to be on, and to be aware of it and intentional about it, and not just habitual. So another aspect in this is that, at least in my approach, is design is a third culture of inquiry, different from science and different from the arts and humanities. And this is a significant piece in that almost always the default, especially in universities and sometimes in governmental or business organizations, the default is around science, because it sort of gives us a sense of security in that we know there's a guarantor. If we follow a certain sequence of inquiry, then the outcome that we get will be what's true, and we can count on that, and that's good. And design needs to have good science supporting it. Arts and humanities have their own assumptions and their own way of seeing the world. And what I'm saying is sort of trying to advance is this notion that design is a third culture of inquiry. It has its own sort of understandings about how we engage in inquiry, how we know what's true or not. And it can kind of be, I guess, it's not like being in a different paradigm, which is still in the science culture. It's a really different way, a tertium quid, a third way of seeing the world, seeing reality. And one of the best ways I can sort of explain this to myself is that you get into a totally different way of seeing something, like the astronauts and cosmonauts said they experienced when they first looked back and saw the Earth. And they all said the way they work, the way they lived, the way they thought about things transformed immediately. They suddenly were changed. And it's called overview effect. And they've written and talked about this a lot. And it's not always that we get to these third or different cultures by the transformation effect, but we do understand that when you're working as an artist, you see the world very differently than if you're a scientist. And I would say as a systemic designer, you see the world in a very different way. So in this case, one of my assertions is that systems and design are conjoined, they're connected. And systemics are the logics of design. And it's why design has gained in acceptability lately, is because systemics, especially in system science, systems research, that sort of thing, gave people enough confidence to say, okay, this is probably something that's real serious. It's almost disciplinary for us. So we can use that in how we design. We can use those different approaches in how we design. So they're the logics of design. So it's also the case that this in systems and systems thinking, systems approach, the things that come up often are that, well, this is really complex. Things are very complex. And they're probably, which is okay, complexity is fine. And it's probably even more than what people believe complexity to be, in that systemic is what we call conjunctive. That means things are combined, not just added together as an aggregation, but they're combined. So in this case, what I champion is in education, the development of systemic designers and what I would call a scholar practitioner. It's very popular nowadays to divide the world into white collar and blue collar practitioners, and that the intellects are different from the people who actually do work. And you've probably read or run into this a lot. People say, well, you know, I think about things and I'm a deep thinker. And other people say, yeah, well, I'm a doer and I make things, and I'm not abstract, I'm not a philosopher. And actually, from this perspective, systemic design perspective, the ideal is to be both. That in this day and age, given all the evidence we have of how things have turned out in the past, it really makes sense for us to think about what we're doing and how we're doing it, and then to have the ability to do it. And there's this notion of emergence, that when things are combined, that you don't just actually get more, like big data or something. You don't just get more of stuff, but there's actually a change, a transformation in our understanding or emergent qualities. So a simple example is water. Hydrogen and oxygen are two atoms, have nothing in either one of them when they're looked at that has the sense of wetness. You put hydrogen and oxygen together in a certain proportion and relationship, and you get wetness, you get water. And interestingly enough, water is still a mystery to scientists, but it's an emergent quality. It disappears when you divide those atoms. So emergence is a part of the whole systemic notion that when you're combining things, putting things together, you will get different qualities. You'll get something like, and for me, the brain is this combination of biological functionings combined. There's this emergence of mind, which is a mystery. Consciousness, all that sort of thing, still the great mystery to people, but it's an emergence. It's not just another aggregation or combination. And the same as conjunction, the same for systemic design, is that it's a combination of systemics and design. So systemic design, for me, is designing. Systemic designing is like laying track for a moving train while on board. So one of the themes that I hope to bring out in this is that you are always a part of the inquiry. You're always a part of what's going on. It's never that we're just looking and observing subjectively, objectively at something out there, something different from ourselves and the way we see the world. So, and one of the exciting things about being a systemic designer is this notion of actually being a part of a system or systems that are moving, transforming, they're quite dynamic, and we're trying to give things direction. We're trying to aim things, we're trying to do things, get them to different ends. So anyway, And this is an example of how it actually looks when we're working. So systemic communication, which is a part of what we're in right now in this presentation, but what we are part of when we're doing projects and working on things, is something that involves inquiry, learning, and sharing. So part of this is that systemic communication involves, we can communicate to ourselves. We become situationally aware, contextually aware. We're self-aware. We have self-reflection. We understand, for instance, which channel we're on when we're listening. But even more than that, we understand sort of our values. We understand our biases, things. That's all part of communication. We're communicating to ourselves when we're engaged in inquiry and learning, and in the sharing process as well. And we have cognitive frame management. We have all these mental images and hypotheses and all these things that we hold that make sense of the world for us. And how do we manage that? How do we know what's not working for us? How do we know what we need to change? And of course, then systemic communication comes a major piece of collaborative inquiry and shared inquiry. So part of what I try to convince people, it's very important to make sure that you get systemic clarity. And this is a book by Russ Aikoff that I highly, highly recommend. And what Russ does is there's this glossary of distinctions. So there's making distinctions between words that people commonly use and what they really mean, like design and systems, for instance, are words that are used in multiple ways. And the important piece in communication and working with people is to make sure that you have clarity around what you're saying when you're talking about systems or design, what they're saying or what you're reading. And then you can have a sort of fair communication and something that develops and grows over time, rather than having a debate where people argue past themselves or past one another typically, and that it doesn't help us to gain greater understanding if we don't have some clarity around what are the terms and the ideas. Obviously not just the terms, it's like the ideas behind the terms. So one of my favorite nowadays is innovation. Everybody talks about innovation. And the way it shows up more and more frequently nowadays is innovation is another word for creativity. And it's actually not, other than being spelled differently. Innovation, at least earlier on, meant when something new became part of someone's life. That was an innovation. It wasn't that it was creativity, or it wasn't something novelty or something like that. It was when something new became part of somebody's life. So for instance, a culture that had never been democratic, when it becomes democratic, that's an innovation, even though the idea of democracy is very old and it's in a number of places. So it's not a novel idea, it's not a creative idea. But if it enters into people's lives collectively, then that's an innovation for them. So that was just one example of that clarity. So systemics, for me, is a umbrella term that's inclusive of any number of, you can see, or you've probably heard all of these terms used, read about them. And the list, trust me, grows extensively if you start looking into it, all the different ways that people use the term system. And it's fine. It's just that we have to be clear when we're talking to one another or when we're doing work that we understand what we mean when we're saying system or systems thinking. And the idea here is to use the term systemics to sort of collectively say, okay, this is inclusive of this family of approaches to inquiry and action that have something in common. And then here are all the different ways that people make distinctions and differentiations. So one of the things that I run into a lot, and I kind of wanted just to, this is my soapbox a bit, just be really careful of with these ideas and these approaches, is that trust me, if you give people easy answers, you'll make money. You'll become well known. The silver bullet, the magic feather, the easy button, people really gravitate towards that, or they'll turn something into a sort of easy button or easy answer. And what happens, a lot of business is famous for this. They'll take a good idea, a great idea, and turn it into a fad, and they'll engage with the fad for a while. And because they haven't engaged fully or deeply with it, it usually fails in their expectations. So then they discard it. So quality control, a lot of these things that have come and gone in the last decades, they were sold to people, and people were eager to get an easy 5-step or 4-step or 3 points, whatever it is, and to think that that's going to be the solution to all their problems. So most recently, for instance, design thinking is one of those sort of easy buttons that people believe 6 steps that's the solution to dealing with innovation and creativity and new design and that sort of thing. I've seen a lot of money and a lot of lost opportunities because people, not just business, but people in government, people in the military, have all bought into this idea of design thinking. And design thinking is not really design anyway. It's creative problem solving, which is fine. If you have a problem that can be creatively solved, it's great. It's a process that came out of the middle of the last century. But nowadays, it's kind of sold, it's coined for people to feel comfortable that, okay, this is the approach, this is the way. And like I say, you can never go wrong by offering people one of these magic feathers or easy buttons or silver bullets. They really, I mean, it's really popular nowadays. And the difficulty is to get people to appreciate that things are more complex. Things demand more time and attention. And if we're going to get what we want, we have to change how we approach these things through these very easy sort of methods and techniques. So another point that I wanted to sort of bring out was this notion that systems and design, but system is used as both a noun and a verb. And that's the way it's used in common parlance all the time. And we have to sort of stop and look and say, okay, is this person talking about systems as real concrete things, or are they talking about systems as an approach to engage in inquiry? So this just brings a bit of the history of the term system, and as both verb and as noun, so that nowadays systems thinking design approach coming from that tradition is sort of denotes the desire to know how things are caused to stand together in unity, system science, or how to cause things to stand together in unity, systems design. But anyway, the notion of system as noun and verb is a long tradition, and the same thing as design. We use design as a noun and as a verb, and plan, same thing, manage, same thing. So here's some systemic design thinking about thinking and action. And I wanted to talk about 3 different things that I think are important to understand and to appreciate. One is stance, one is approach, and one is process. And this is becoming how we become self-aware or cognitively aware of what we're doing, where we're standing, what are we standing on, where are we going, and how do we go forward. So stance, for instance, and this is just an example, stance, postulates, assertions, beliefs, assumptions. A lot of people are just sort of just not aware of what their assertions and beliefs and assumptions are that they're working from. And if you're working in a particular area like art or science, people just assume that we're all working from the same postulates and assertions. But in systemic design, of course, we have to be careful and go back and look, pay attention to what are the assertions and the beliefs and assumptions that we're standing on, and what do we want to remain there, and what do we want to change, and what do we want to put in its place. So an example, for instance, is this notion about design freedoms. This is just one example. And we can say, okay, then as a postulate assertion, we buy into the notion that there's free will, and there's epistemic freedom, and there's ontologic freedom. There's actually, we have choice in these things, and we have the freedom to choose amongst different stances and approaches. So this is just, again, one example of a stance. There are a number of postulates, of course, that and assertions and beliefs. And often I work with people in the beginning. I have ways that people can begin to look at and appreciate what I have called the bottom turtle. What's the turtle they're standing on, from which everything else makes sense for them. And then for groups, what's the shared bottom turtle? What's the shared ground that they're standing on, so that you can do collaborative work, teamwork. So approaches about intention, about aim, what direction are we going in? So this is also something that needs to be paid attention to in the very beginning. If you're working on projects or you're engaged in a systemic design process, is what are you up to? Are you engaged in informing, fixing and repairing, transforming, forming? What is it that you're really up to? And amazingly, people are often unclear about this. They'll assume that everybody's has the same intention, and it's not the case. For instance, I have colleagues who are in design science, design research, and their intention is to inform people about what design is and what design inquiry and that is. Managers, consultants, their intention is to fix and repair systems, to intervene and fix and repair. And then you have people who at another level want to reform how systems are operating. We have a lot of that going on nowadays with major systems, trying to get them to be more equitable, trying to get them to be less destructive, be sustainable, all of those sorts of things, and get them to reform or transformed. And then in a lot of cases, we want to design brand new systems. We want to create new systems. We want to form them. So the intention or the aim is different in every one of these cases. And we need to be really clear from the beginning. What is the intention? What are we up to? What direction are we going in? Because we may assume that outcomes are actually an indicator of approach or intention, and they're not. They're just the sort of markers along the path to show us whether or not is this the kind of outcome that would appear if we were going in the direction we want to go in. So this is another example of approaches of intention and that's intention spelled with a T this time and rather than an S. And this intention is around outcomes and purpose. So the approach in the beginning, paying attention, is, are we in bounded systems? Are we problem solving? And it happens, I guess the majority of time, people will talk about, well, this is a problem and therefore we have to, or this kind of problem. So the problem becomes the justification for action or the trigger for action. What the problem does, though, is it bounds the system for us. It places it in time. It creates a kind of understanding of what the system is. And then we decide, okay, which one of the best sort of outcomes do we want for this bounded problem? Which one of these things will solve the problem? And then we can go to projects, which are more closely related to design itself, where we're working on unbound systems. And it's an indeterminate state, whereas in bounded system, there's a determinate state or a determinate outcome. We assume that there is the right solution, there's the right outcome. In unbounded design projects, the outcomes are indeterminate. So we have to set what it is that we want as an outcome. It's part of a search process. And then in systemic design, we're bounding systems. And it means we're creating, we're naming and framing, we're creating the boundaries, we're saying what's included and excluded. So anyway, this is just an example of how our assumptions around what the intentions, what the outcomes, or the purpose of what we're doing is different, or can be quite different in whether or not we're dealing with problems or projects or systemic designs or advanced designs. And then systemic design process. Again, this is an example that one of the things that's not often appreciated is that there is an arrow of time when we're engaged in inquiry and action. And that it's like unlighting a match. You can't do it. You start someplace, you go through stages, phases, have emergence, you go through, it's like cooking a meal or something. You start with basic elements, you put them in combined formulas, you do things, heat them, cool them, whatever, and you come up with an ultimate particular. So this is just an example of a process that shows this arrow of time. That's always fundamental. There's a lot of sort of models that I see for designing, for inquiry, that show things in circles, but it's not possible to go back in time to return to an original or a predetermined place. It's always, things are always changed. There was somebody, I can't remember the Greek philosopher's name right now, said you can't step into the same river twice. I had a friend who actually got a Nobel Prize pointing this out to scientists who had kind of, I guess, forgotten about it. But this notion that there is this arrow of time, and in complex systems in particular, the system goes through transformations and changes and emergence that can't be undone, can't be reversed. And the system goes to different states and different structures and forms. So it's a very important piece to understand about systems. So just because people sort of get frustrated with a lot of this abstract stuff, I'll get asked a lot, well, what is a real system? Well, start to look at real systems, then, for example, what we're interested in is the constituents. How do we understand what are the elements? What's in betweens in the elements and components? What are the boundaries, limits? And how do we understand them? How do we set them? So interestingly, Wes Churchman, my mentor and friend, dear friend, had this understanding of what a system was. And he said that the definition of a system is a design choice. And this is really an important piece. It's not that systems are out there. There's not real systems in existence out there that we go and observe and touch. Their system is what we decide it is, how we want to look at it, where we want to set the frame. It's sort of like the shadows on the cave, Plato's cave wall, are projections. They're not actually shadows of real things. It's our projections of what we think these real things are. And of course, this creates a lot of responsibility and accountability for designers, and it is the reason that design needs to be taken seriously as a sort of more than just a discipline. It's a profession, because designers, planners, other agents in those agent roles say what a system is. People who sort of pretend, okay, there is that system, that's real, they sort of gloss over or go around this notion that somebody, maybe not them, somebody has said that's a system. So that's an education system. That's what it looks like. And there it is right there. Or a health system. And the fact is that somebody said that's what a health system is. That's what's inside. This is what's outside. This is foreground. This is background. These are the edges. Somebody has made that decision. And it's important as a systemic designer to understand the role that we play in that, the role we play in framing and naming in systems. What I really appreciated, as an example, again, is that Wes Churchman defined a system by peopling it with people in certain roles. And rather than a system defined by like components, technical components or concrete components, that sort of thing, he peopled his systems by people. And he said a system is something that includes these people doing these kinds of things. And that's been, for me, a very useful way of approaching situations and saying, what is the system here? So for example, these systems roles that Wes said are all in a system. Those roles have relationships with one another. They're not just isolated. This is, again, of course, this is systems, systemic. What are the relationships? So there's relationships between the observer designer and the client, for instance, or the stakeholder, or the surrogate client. So what are the protocols of those relationships, the rules of relationship? So in an objective, scientific, rational way, the protocol is I-it. And it's that you know, especially even in social science, you know that you're being objective when you treat the other as an it. And you collect data, you measure, you do whatever as an it, as an objective external to you. You can say the protocol, for instance, is I, you, which is more of a professional team, maybe related protocol in a team setting. I, thou, obviously, it's when there's an exchange of feelings in the protocols, the feelings. I, us is about membership. I, them is about alienation. We have a lot of that going on now in the world. We have a lot of protocols that are in place where it's not just that something is an it, it's a them, it's an other. They're not part of the tribe, they're not part of this group. So again, just an example of all the different ways of defining systems. Akoff and Emery can recommend them highly as an example of how you technically define a system in great detail. You'll see a lot of ways that people say what a system is in literature and presentations and videos and that sort of thing. But I find these very helpful, and they take things and make them more transparent, or bring us into a greater depth of understanding, and sort of make it clear what our assumptions are and our postulates. And there's a lot of ways to categorize systems or put the types of systems listing. And this is one way Russell Akoff categorized systems by their ability to make decisions or make choices. So this is something he's put together, and he has several of these schema, different kinds, different ways of looking at systems with different abilities, different components, different kinds of interrelationships. So this is, again, just an example of how we categorize and understand systems. So as an example, what's a systems approach to making sense of a technical system? Just for example, let's take a look at a car. So we're going to research, we're going to look into something. So is this a car? We don't know. So we have all these elements and things, and we go through it, inventory, sort of collect things, then we go discover categories and patterns. This is sort of like data, big data, then looking for the emergent patterns and categories that come out of big data and try to say what it is. Darwin, for instance, was very influential in how biologists and others would look at the elements and then put them into categories and patterns. So they would say, okay, is this fossil, is this thing, does it belong to the horse family? Or does it belong to the snail family? Or, what category, what kind of pattern comes together in these things are brought together. So I suspect this is not a car, but research doesn't guarantee anything other than a description of what's there. So we can look and take an example of something that we presume is a car, and we can go through an analysis and look at what the components are, what their interrelationships are, what their interconnections. So this goes well beyond inventory, well beyond just the patterns. It puts things into interrelationships and interconnections or understandings. And what Akoff said was most important from his perspective is to look in between things. So when somebody tells you to look at an organization, for instance, so you look into the organization, you see the people that are in there, and the important thing is to look not at what an individual is doing, who they are, but what is the relationships in between people, or in between people and technology, or in between. So if you're going to change, adjust, or understand, you have to look in between. And that's kind of one of the strengths, I think, of a systemic perspective, is that we're looking in between, in addition to looking at components now, which science is very good at. But for good science, we need to have this understanding of what's going on in between. Then if we're going to make changes, or if we're going to create things where we have to create in-betweens, we have to choose what the components are, then that's extremely important. So synthesis, this is an emergent quality. This is a car. You take this thing apart, you don't have a car. You take a wheel off, look at the wheel, that's not a car. So synthesis gives us form. We look at something and we look at the emergent qualities that appear, at the totalities. So one of the things that happens in business, in government, and in academia is that, going back to the notion of inventories and patterns, is that people will look at, for instance, the wheel, and they will say, okay, we're going to optimize the wheel, and we're going to take this part. So what happens is you can optimize the wheel and sub-optimize the performance of the automobile as a whole, as a form, as a synthesis. And that happens with business organizations. Happens all the time. Is marketing will optimize something within their division, and that sub-optimize then production or something like that. So another thing is to look around and look at the meta systems and the peer systems and the things that are going on around. This is a notion, an idea of an open system, how a system is influenced, how it gets resources, how it gets things from its environment. It's not just from the environment, it's actually from other systems, or we can see it. We can say that's how it takes place, is that we get inputs from other systems, meta systems, and peer systems. And then we really look around and we look at context, environment, and function, looking up, looking out, and how we understand the system then is, how does it fit into its environment? How does it fit into its context? How does it fit in and serve the meta system? How does it interrelate with the peer systems? And then, of course, it's important always provenance, looking back. What influenced this system, how it appears now? And looking ahead, what's the perspective for the system? How is it going to begin to evolve into the future? How might it? How do we want it to evolve into the future? So those are all different ways of looking at an automobile, a technical system, for instance. So in a quick summary, what I'd like to say is that what I hope you sort of take away from this is that this notion that systems and design are verbs and nouns, and they're used that way so that system and design is inquiry and action. So the difference for me for systemic design, like system science, is about describing and explaining and predicting and controlling. But description and explanation do not prescribe action. You have to have design as a part of that to help develop the prescription for action for a number of reasons. So systems plus design is inquiry for action and followed by action. And then as a noun, systems and design together create human augmentation. It's a part of this notion of evolution, where we're progressing by moving forward with additions to what our normal abilities and capabilities are. What Freud called sort of prosthetic gods. We have all these things that we put on and adapt, or try to adapt to, that augment what we can't do already. And this is what I term like designers, systemic designers, as lame gods for a number of reasons. But anyway, sort of lame gods in the service of prosthetic gods. And that this notion of evolution is now as much about what we design, what we do intentionally, as is the outcome of accident and that sort of thing. So to sort of close up, I'd like to invite any of you that wanted to go to my website, and I have a lot of literature and videos and things listed on the website if you wanted to go further into at least my ancestors, the people that influenced me and ideas. And there's a lot of information projects that I'm working on in conjunction or in relationship to systemic design. So that's the end of my presentation. What I'm going to try to do is get out of here now so I can see all of you and take questions. So hang in there. You're still there. Nobody's left. Or you came back really quickly, didn't you? So I guess now we take questions, right?
Yep, that's fine. Just remind you need to either take the questions loud or just move forward towards the microphone.
Either way.
I have a little bit of a silly question. Is there anything that is not in the system?
Sorry, I didn't understand. No, I didn't understand what he said.
I asked, is it anything that is not part of a system as you view it?
So it's your choice. You decide what's part of the system or what's not part of the system. So it's our choice. We're the ones that make up this notion of what a system is. So we can say those people aren't part of this system, or that thing is not part of the system. Or we can say, okay, now we have to include them. So now we're doing that with people who need help with access, for instance. Now they're part of the system. They're part of the transportation system. We chose to make them a part of it, whereas before they weren't. They were on their own, sort of. So that help?
Yeah.
We can still see your presentation in the background there.
Okay.
Can you just do a
So,
share?
So if there are any questions that somebody has about a particular slide, I can go back and find that, I believe.
Yeah. I had a question about the technical definition. Sorry, it was of the system. If you could have that slide on. Next one. Yeah, that one. So the concrete system, a system of at least two of whose elements are objects. Could you, an example of actually both the 215 and 216?
Okay. So I would say, and I'm not trying to speak for Russ or Fred, they're way smarter than I am, or were way smarter than I am. But I would say that for abstract systems, for instance, inquiring systems are abstract systems. Communication systems are abstract systems. Concrete system would be a social tech system, so that you have social systems, which are abstract, in some ways, and very concrete systems, which like computers, databases, things like that, mainframes, they're all quite concrete. The same way would be with transportation systems. In transportation systems, you have automobiles and highways and rails and trains. And the abstract part, of course, is what are people's desires? What are the social systems, the norms, expectations that these technical objects are serving? So did that help?
Yes, thank you. And then I get a bit curious, what do we gain from dividing abstract and concrete systems? Why don't we just talk about them as systems?
Well, again, it's that notion of the differences that make a difference. So if we try, and if we don't lump things together in these kind of general labels, if we try to understand, for instance, nowadays, people are making technology like artificial intelligence. They're trying to make a technology appear as if it's a living system, and it's not. It's not made out of anything that's living at all. It's dead matter. But people try to make the distinction, try to give characteristics and qualities to artificial systems like intelligence, learning, all those things, as if it's a living system. So it really helps, and it really helps people understand and relate to systems if they know whether or not this is an abstract system, a concrete system. And I would say, going beyond Russ and Fred, is it a living system? Is it a belief system? There's a lot of other kinds that are just as important. But yeah, I think it's really, really important. And the advantage, of course, is that in the case of the computer or AI, for instance, you're not treating AI as a person, or you're not treating a person as an AI. That's a hugely important ethical distinction. So by being very careful in how we define the concrete and abstract and living systems and things, then I think we can be more ethical. We can create actually better outcomes and systems than we have now. People are getting very concerned right now, for instance, that there are robots employed, military robots employed, that are programmed to kill people. They're actually being used now. Israel, places like that are actually using these robots. So what people are calling slaughter bots, that sort of thing. And the US, of course, the military is developing those kind of robots. So for us to appreciate and understand and make decisions about the ethics and the functionality and everything, we have to understand, be able to make a distinction. Well, what is that robot? What are its responsibilities and accountabilities? A concrete system is actually a part of an abstract system in that there are handlers in the back. I mean, that's part of the thing with AI nowadays being biased and have bias built into them. It's not the AI that's biased against people of color or different sexual orientations or something. It's the people who programmed it. So we have to make those distinctions to understand then at a deeper level what we can do to make a difference. Do we want to make a difference? How would we make choices in the future? Because issues of ethics, around ethics and that, like social media right now, I don't know if you've seen this, the Social Dilemma video. I highly recommended it if you haven't seen it. There are all these young designers who are saying, we're really sorry for what we did with Google and Facebook and all these things, all the damage, the social damage that our designs have done. So they're apologizing for being bad designers and creating bad designs. So how do we not create bad designs? How do we not do damage? How do we become better designers, ethically, socially. I don't even remember if I was answering that question, but there I was.
I have a question. I don't know if you can see me.
Nope. Got to take front. There you go.
Hello. My question is about the sensitivity towards the in-between. From your experience, what is a way of raising the awareness, so even becoming more sensitive to the in-between? What is that?
Yeah.
What is that skill set composed of?
Yeah. So for me, for example, one of the big things in between, I'm very interested in social systems and designing social systems, changing social systems. The in between, the relationship in between people, for instance, the agents of change and the people who are being changed. What is that relationship? And I know universities with design programs and professions who are encouraging students and practitioners, for instance, to nudge people, to get them to change, or push them, nudge them, because the agent knows what's better for that person than the person does. So you have to go in and you have to nudge and change. And that's different from, for instance, from a contract of service, where the other is an equal. I don't know if in Norwegian law, but in American law, in my law schools or law classes, and that my understanding was, or the reality of a contract is that it's only a valid contract between people if they're equals, if there's an equal exchange of value. So a woman that influenced me a lot, the doctor, talked about this notion of too often people want to engage in fixing and helping. So they treat the other, the relationship is that that person is broken or helpless and I need to do something, rather than serving the other, which is a relationship, a contractual relationship. And working with, in other countries over the years, when you go in and you have an attitude or a mindset, whether you're with the United Nations or whether you're going to fix and help people, they resent you very quickly. Who in the hell are you? And why do you have all the resources? And why do you get to tell me what needs to get fixed and how it needs to get fixed? But if you're there in a service relationship and say, what do you want? Who are you? How can we help you become what you want to become? That's a totally different relation. That's an in-between. All of those are in-between relationships. How we contract, we're agents. And whether or not it's an implied contract, like when you're creating products like Apple Computer and that, the contract is that buyer beware. We're going to create stuff and we're going to sell it to you. And we're going to do whatever we can to sell you this. That's the contract. And you have the right to buy or not and adjust or not. So that's a very common sort of design contract nowadays. We've got another kind of contract now that we're concerned about, and that's with future generations. So we have received in the United States and other parts of the world, we've created nuclear waste, for instance, that goes out generations and generations. So what's the contract we have with those generations? What's between us? What's the relationship between us and future generations and what we're doing now? So people now have this feeling, oh my God, the world's on fire. And we have, okay. So that's affecting relationship with us. And it's, I have to say, this is a bit of an editorial. I've been deeply disappointed and disturbed. I've taught in systems for decades. And systems as nouns have sort of been accepted. They've gotten innovated into the public. So people talk about ecosystems, they talk about health systems. Systems thinking, systems as a verb, has not. It's been a real kind of failure because now, at least in the US, people say and act as if they're isolated from and totally disconnected from other people and their environments, and it's only rights, not responsibilities. They only have rights, they have individual rights. They're total islands in this social network, have no understanding of themselves as an element in a larger system and of responsibilities and accountabilities. So that's been, for me, a real kind of disappointment in what we thought we were up to, trying to introduce systems thinking into the larger societies. And that includes academia, that includes government, that includes, I mean, our militaries. We failed at all those levels over these years. Although everybody talks about systems now, certainly, as concrete things. Computer systems, information systems, they get that. They don't get that. They're actually a part of a system and of a complex system, not that they're a part of a group or a crowd where they're not distinct at all. They're just an element of an aggregation. There's no in-between relationship there. The in-between is when there are people that are unique, valuable, have characters, qualities of their own, and how does that interrelate with others and what emerges from that. So that was a long answer. I'm sorry, I just took advantage.
Thank you.
I just have a follow-up, quick, just to ask, is there a, maybe I'll just, so you.
Who let this guy in? Wait, who let this guy in?
So my question is about health system analysis. That's my area of, I'm just looking for material that can elaborate what you just spoke about the different constituents of a health system, because there seems to be a lot of misunderstanding as to what constitutes a health system. So the question, it's more of an ask. If there's any reference material, I would really appreciate if you could share any specialist who works in that area to define what a health system and the particularities of health system.
Yeah. So interestingly, I've been doing a lot of work lately in Australia with doctors, nurses, psychiatrists, and psychologists, others around health systems, particular ones. And so they have created programs that have not been documented thoroughly yet, but have been quite successful. So it's impressive, and it's about redefining what health is in a way. So right now, I would say I would highly recommend, I had a dear friend, Len Duell. He was a psychiatrist at, he was on my committee at Berkeley. And he became quite famous for this idea of healthy cities. And he said, health is not medicine and doctors. Health is a quality of life. It's a way of life. It's a way of working with life. And he started this whole notion about how do we redefine what health is, and this notion of what healthy cities would be. So the idea started in the Western Hemisphere, northern part, and now it's the largest program in the United Nations, and it has more countries in the southern and eastern parts of the globe than in the West. And every society, every country has defined health differently. So in Denmark, Copenhagen, it's green trees, it's bikes, it's paths, parks. In Colombia, it's about accountability. It's about how you budget to take care of people, for people. So there's quite a broad variety of ways of people expressing what a healthy city is. And they get to do that in their own way. The interesting thing for me was Len designed a seed, an idea that just exploded around the globe in all these different settings and is getting expressed in different ways. And it's all about health. It's all about health, and it's how you design healthy cities. So I highly recommend looking at the United Nations Healthy Cities Program, looking at Len Duell's writings.
Thank you.
Hi, Harold.
Yes,
You
I'm still here.
Do you remember me?
I remember you. I still,
huh?
I still
go
have
on.
your poster. I still have
Oh,
your
really?
poster of you, your picture.
Thank you. You shortly mentioned this notion of prosthetic gods, like in the sense that the car is a prosthesis for our legs, and if I got you right, and the computer is a prosthesis of the brain, etc. It made me think about this really cool lecture by Bruno Latour, A Cautious Prometheus, if you know that. Yeah. But my question is, do you think that systemic design can go beyond that notion of us designing for us being prosthetic, improving our prosthesis somehow, and the relation between us as a species and the world is maybe a bit changed?
Yeah. So the challenge, I think, in this notion is that evolution used to be primarily about accidents, environmental accidents, things that happened, and living systems would adjust or accommodate environments changing and that sort of thing. Nowadays, scientists cannot find a natural system to study any place on the globe. There are no natural systems any longer. Every system, however you define it, has been influenced and has evidence of human intervention, human activity. So we're literally living in a different age. They've retitled it now the Anthropocene, the age of the human influence. So evolution has changed. So for designers now, this understanding has to be, we're not reactive. And this is a thing that I fight or argue with people all the time in business, government, military, academia. Everybody is set up to be reactive. The problem is we got to get away from here. This is a bad thing, rather than being proactive, which is what design is. Design advances into the future. Problem solving and the rest back into the future. They're backing away from something. They're backing away from things they don't like, rather than advancing towards things we do want. And we're not good at helping people understand how to think about what we desire. We can go in a million different directions. We can evolve. It's not determined. It's not predetermined by physical systems or biologic systems. It's not predetermined. We can evolve in a multitude of directions. Our challenge as systemic designers is, how do we set the direction? Which is part of the intention, this intention with an S. How do we set direction? Because if we want certain outcomes and we're not going in the right direction, we'll never have the opportunity for those outcomes to appear. We have to be going in the right direction for those outcomes that we find desirable to let them appear. And it's really a challenge to get people to begin to think about being proactive rather than reactive. People get obviously read the news, and people get very reactive. They get very angry. They know what makes them mad. They know what scares them. They know what's broken. They know all those things, but they can't express very well what do they think is desirable. What's desirable? What do you want to work towards? What direction do you want to go in? And then whatever we design, whatever artifact comes up, whatever piece that we attach to us, it becomes something that is a marker that we're going in the right direction. So I'm not sure, for instance, that Facebook is a marker of us going in the right direction. I'm not against computers. I'm not against AI technology. It's just, and the same goes with the murder bots and all the rest of it. I'm not sure that those are markers that we're going in the right direction. What would be the markers that we're going in the right direction? And it doesn't have to be particulars. We don't have to say we want this particular, ultimate particular thing to appear. We just have to say, okay, we want to go in this direction. And then along that direction, we can create ultimate particulars that will be a show of whether or not, yeah, this seems we're in the right direction. This is what we want to do, what we want to become. And we all humans don't all have to go in the same direction. We can be going in different directions. And the challenge is to, of course, work on the interrelationships, the in-betweens of people who are choosing this way of life and this way of life and this kind of cultural expression, so that we don't have to turn people into these communities of sameness and sort of set out the social police to make sure everybody looks and acts and does the same. So did that help, Berger?
Sure. Interesting.
Good. More questions?
Maybe a comment?
Yeah.
Is this you? Yeah. I'm wondering, maybe this being reactive, this natural human thing of being more reactive than active, has to be a chosen part of the design process, because I think that we're so good in knowing what we don't want. Maybe this makes us not being ready for starting being active in the process. And if we first have the possibility to like empty everything that we don't want, maybe it becomes a better process in actually facilitating for what do we want then.
Yeah. So this is at heart of what I'm doing at the moment, thinking about, and it's called, I'm calling it the design mind. And it turns out that the design mind in humanoids began to appear way before humans, modern humans did. And we were proactively creating things like tools. We created technologies like fire, we created clothes, we created societies, cultures, religions. We created all those things out of desire. We wanted things, and that design mind has slowly been evolving and growing. In the pre-Socratic era in the Western tradition, Sophia, wisdom, was the wise hand, not the reactive hand, it was the wise hand. So that the Greeks combined knowing and doing together. That was wisdom. That was the prudent action, phronesis, prudence. In then the post-Socratic era, Sophia was divided, and the doing and the thinking that was split. And so in the Republic, for instance, those who made things and did things fell to the bottom of the hierarchy, and those who thought about things went to the top. So for centuries, we haven't had a good tradition of thinking about what we wanted to do and why, and combining thinking and doing. So I think that reaction then sort of set in as a substitute for this lack of experience and tradition. We don't know, we don't have a long tradition of thinking about what we want to do, where we want to go, and having design to take us there. I mean, the Greeks would wonder, like, how did that ship appear in the harbor that never existed there before? How did they do that? How did we do that? How did that happen? That temple on the hill, how did that thing appear that wasn't there before? And they were building a tradition with that. So now, because we don't have that kind of tradition, there's been this vacuum for justifying change, justifying triggering change. So I have students, used to have most students do this. For instance, read newspapers when there were newspapers, watch television, read news magazines when there were news magazines, that kind of thing, and see how many times change was justified because there was a problem versus how many times change was justified because somebody desired something. And it was always 99 point whatever percent that change was justified because there was a problem. It's easy for, and it's a number of things. It removes responsibility. I do find this in business, military. If you can have a problem, then there's no accountability. There's that problem. That problem has to be fixed. You're not a part of it. That's a problem. It needs to change action. But in design, what takes precedent is judgment, professional judgment. Why you're valuable to society is because you're more consistent at making good judgments than anybody else. It's not decision making, it's judgments. And judgments bring responsibility, it brings accountability, it brings a lot, and people don't like to do that. If you're managing for your career, you avoid judgments. You can take problems as a kind of a mask for doing things that you're not accountable for. The business does good because you solved problems, not because you took the business in a certain direction. Is that somewhat of an answer? By the way, design takes courage. Design takes character because we're serving others in a contractual relationship, agency. But it also takes courage because of this notion of judgment and proacting versus reacting. We are out there making those choices about direction, and we'll be held accountable for that. That's scary. What's the guarantor for us doing the right thing, going in the right direction? But it's real courage, and some people love it. They think it's great.
Thank you. I think that was a very good final comment. It takes courage. We need the courage. Anybody burning in with a question? Really needing a break, I think.
Well, congratulations on your new program.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we say thank you to Harold. Give him applause.
Thank you.
one short little session afterwards. So 10 minutes break and then just a short session. Thank you very much, Harold.
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Thank you, Harold. Send my greetings to Anne.
I will.
Yeah. And
Man.
I'm sure we will see you soon again, also during this program. So
Okay.
pleasure to see you again.
Yeah, me too. And stay in touch and let me know how the program's going.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. We have a wonderful group here with really superb backgrounds, and it's really, really interesting to do this.
Yeah, they look like good students. It's my favorite kind of student. It reminds me of when I was in whole systems design, experienced a little bit, and also working with the Naval Postgraduate School. Experience,
Yeah.
you know, but not with so much baggage that they can't learn. They don't have so much.
Yeah. Okay. Have a nice day. It's your morning, so enjoy the rest of it.
Well, that's what's wrong. It's morning. Okay. I knew there was something.
I think your camera is here, isn't it?
Yeah.
Can you see us?
Yes.
Hi, Harold.
I
It was a pleasure to hear you talk again. And I had to say hello, a warm hello from Raquel, our institute leader.
All right.
She couldn't come, but I had to pass on greetings to you from her.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. I miss all you guys in Oslo. You're
Yeah,
safe.
you should
Only
come.
I have my 2 shots now, so you're not so safe.
Okay, take care. Thank you very much.
See you.
Hey,
Yeah.
bye. I'm going to leave now, Andreas.
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you very much for perfect. Everything worked smooth. Thank you.
What kind of recording did you do, by the way?
I just did a Zoom recording, so it's just recording your whole what's happening on my screen actually.
Okay, so I could maybe get a copy of that at some point.
Absolutely.
All right.
It takes a few hours to convert, but I'll send it to you tomorrow morning Norwegian time.
Okay, and you have a Dropbox?
Yeah. So I put in my Dropbox and I send you a link.
Okay, cool. Thank you, sir. Appreciate it. Thank you, Veronica. Thanks for the coffee.
You're welcome.